All right, welcome. I'm very excited to introduce Andrew Pyper as our final Starfest presenter. Andrew was part of Starfest 2013, and I was amazed that someone who wrote such scary books could be so funny. I still remember that event. Andrew Pyper was born in Stratford, Ontario. I'm not going to say the year he was born. I'll just skip that. He received a BA and an MA in English Literature from McGill University, as well as a law degree from the University of Toronto. Although he was called to the bar in 1996, he never practiced. His most recent novels before The Residence included The Homecoming, The Only Child, and The Damned. His 2013 novel, The Demonologist, won the International Thriller Writers Award for Best Hardcover Novel and was a #1 bestseller in Canada and Brazil. So we brought in a perennial library favorite to interview Andrew. Marty Chan writes plays for adults, books for kids, and tweets for fun. He was the Citadel Theatre's first playwright in residence, and the Alberta Foundation for the Arts named Marty one of the 25 most influential artists of 2016. You might wonder why we asked, essentially a children's writer to interview Andrew, but theater fans might remember his hit thriller, The Bone House, a play about the hunt for a serial killer that brings the monster right into the theater among the audience members. Marty works and lives in Edmonton with his wife, Michelle, and their cat, Buddy. So before I hand things over to Andrew and Marty, I just want to remind you, we do want this to be an interactive event. So please put your questions, put your comments in the chat throughout the whole evening. And if you haven't had a chance to purchase Andrew's new book, The Residence, we'll put links to Audrey's books and Glass Bookshop in the comments. So I'm going to hand things over. Enjoy the evening.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. Thank you, Michelle, for that introduction. And thank you to everyone for joining us on this final event of Starfest 2021. Now, we've saved the best for last. Andrew Pyper, a phenomenal writer of supernatural thrillers. I had the good fortune to read his book, The Residence, and you are going to want to run out and buy that book. But don't do it right now, because we're going to talk to Andrew first. So Andrew, good evening. How are you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. I mean, I wish we were live and in person, but we're going to make do with this virtual presentation. So we're going to talk a little bit about, well, I have a list of questions that I want to ask you, but it's not going to make sense to the people who are watching until they know a little bit about what The Residence is about. So I could fumble my way through a description, but I thought since the creator is here, let's go straight to the source. I'm going to turn the Zoom over to you to tell us what The Residence is all about. And everyone, sit back, relax, and get ready for a conversation with Andrew Pyper.
Well, great. Thanks, Marty. Yeah, so I will also kind of stumble through a description of the book, or it's because it's an unusual book in that it is a ghost story or a horror novel, certainly supernatural fiction, but based on real events set in the White House. And so you might think, well, hold on, what kind of real events that might relate to a ghost story are not known about probably the most famous building, certainly the most famous residence in the world. And this story relates to the presidency, the one-term presidency of Franklin Pierce. His term in office was from 1853 to 1857. So essentially, roughly the sort of, just the years immediately prior to the Civil War. And he is a president. If you have never heard of Franklin Pierce, you don't need to feel guilty about that. He is probably among the least known and the least regarded until very recently presidents in American history. He is, by all accounts, an ineffectual president, and in fact, his failings gave rise, to a large extent, to the eventuality that was the Civil War. That's not the primary interest of the novel, though. The novel is interested in the marriage between Franklin and Jane Pierce, his first lady. And Franklin and Jane suffered an unbelievable loss just prior to their entering the White House, the loss of all three of their children, the most recent of whom died, there's Benny pictured there, in a freak train derailment in which he was the sole fatality. And this happened just days prior to Franklin's inauguration. Jane entered the White House just broken by grief, and she was extremely reluctant to move into the White House. She did not want to go there. In fact, Franklin broke a promise to her that he would not seek the presidency. And she was known in the local press as the Phantom of the White House. She refused to leave her second floor apartment in her second floor room, and there spent all of her time writing letters to her deceased son, Benny. And according to her letters, Benny returned to her. She pleaded in her letters for him to come back. And in her letters, she claimed that he in fact did. Not as a spiritual comfort, but in material form. And so it was that jumping off point that gave rise to the fictionalizing that I do in the Residence, which tells both, again, it melds those kind of historical elements and tells a fictional ghost story set in a very, very familiar place.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I love the blend of historical elements and supernatural elements. And I'm wondering, like, how did you come across this idea of going a not very well known president and combine it with elements of horror and ghost story? Like, how did those circuits come together for you to come up with this book?
Well, it's interesting. You probably know yourself, Marty, that where a book or story comes from. It has varied sources. This is an unusual one for me because it came very out of nowhere. I was not looking to write a historical novel. I very, very intentionally did not want to do that work. And I'm not a historian, and writing a historical novel invites all manner of potential problems of, like, getting the history right, or especially when you blend it with fiction. So I did not want to do that. But it just so happened that I was, like many of us, was wasting my time Googling. And I was Googling about haunted houses. And this is something I do a lot. I wasn't trying to research a novel or anything deliberate like that. I came upon the White House, which I knew to be, known to be haunted and the kind of trite, Lincoln's ghost, that kind of thing. But in that Googling, I went further down the rabbit hole and discovered Jane Pierce. It wasn't Franklin, actually, that I discovered first. It was Jane and her letters. And I became instantly fascinated by this woman who was put into this situation that essentially was a prison to her, and the tremendous loss that she had endured, and the letters that she wrote to her son pleading with him to return. That to me, as soon as I read that, I set aside the project that I was actually writing and embarked on what became The Residence right away, which is I've never done that in my career. I'd never sort of stumbled on a fact or a bit and just pushed everything aside. It just felt very compelling to me.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about, like, when you saw the relationship, like, with Jane and the letters to her son. it brings to mind the question of somebody who's writing a supernatural thriller. You can explore, you know, the paranormal occurrences, but in your novels, in many of your novels, in addition to The Residence, you also explore sort of the sort of human nature, and you explore sort of the pain and loss that people have. Is that sort of your guide when you're sitting down and developing an idea? Like you go, are you going to start with the supernatural, or do you start with the characterizations?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in truth, you know, it's typically some kind of, you know, those races that you see with a bunch of, you know, turtles, and they're released and off they go at this tremendously comically slow pace, and one's overtaking the other. You know, so the question of, you know, plot versus concept versus character, what leads the way? It's a bit like a tortoise race. Everyone gets to lead for a moment or two, but in this case, and that's true, in fact, of all the novels, that it needs to be a marriage of some kind of driving concept, something that just interests me on the level of just a, you know, a one sentence idea. And I don't mean that commercially. I just mean something that's like, well, that's an exciting question. And then that must be married to some a problem, a threat, something. It could be something frightening, or it could be raise stakes. You know, why do we care? Why are we even in this world? Why are we telling the story? And then finally, I think the other ingredient is a human element, something that I can hold on to, you know, a character or a dynamic between characters. In the case of The Residence, it's the marriage between Franklin and Jane, which really fascinated me, because Franklin was known to be, by all onlookers, to be this very vibrant, athletic, handsome, appealing. He was one of those, he in fact was from a very early age recognized to be a future leader. Whether he kind of wanted that or not is a separate question, but he was almost a sort of, before the age of television, he was a sort of an image first individual and president. He had his pick of, and if any of the young women of, you know, the Northeastern political set, and he chose Jane, who was always ill, sickly, didn't like going to dances, didn't like socializing, was far less robust than even her two older sisters. It posed a question: why did these two fall in love? Because they did have a very successful marriage. They went through this tragedy together, this trauma, their time in the White House, but they had by all accounts, a wonderful retirement after this. That they had, you know, a very happy and long marriage. The why, or how, what they saw in each other and what bound them together fascinated me. And I think one of a premise of the novel is that all marriages are based, at least in part, on a secret. Not necessarily a dark secret, not necessarily something bad, but within marriages, I think all married people would know this, there are things that we can only really share with our partner. We might not even do that verbally. It might be something that's just understood. But marriages, as much as they are about transparency and sharing, they are also about the maintaining of secrets. And so that was the final piece for me of exploring fictionally why these two found each other and stayed together.
I love that notion of marriage around a secret, because I think about the conversations that I have with my wife, and there are things that we talk about that I would never say in public. So it's a comfort zone that you have with your partner, and especially if you think about the stress of having to be, you know, in the White House with all the trappings of what it means to be the president. I can only imagine that your only ally in that building is your partner, and I think about the pressures that Franklin would have been under through all this, which in some ways can contribute to the stress of that can impact a marriage. So I'm thrilled to know that in their retirement that they actually continued to have a happy and long marriage together. Now,
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Now, the other thing that I find interesting is that you sort of touch on this sort of relationship between Jane and Franklin, and it's something that I found that you explored in a lot of your other books. the family dynamic. I'm just going to digress a bit. We'll come back to the residents, but I think about things like what is that one? The Homecoming. I think the
Hmm.
Homecoming, where you've got the sort of families that are coming together, and then they learn some secrets about their deceased father, which I'm not going to give away too much on that one. But you explore that family dynamic. The Only Child is another one where you're exploring a family dynamic. Again, I can't talk about it too much without giving away the premise or the twist. But we do see this exploration of families, how sometimes they're broken and how sometimes they come together. Is that a deliberate choice that you're making when you're sitting down and putting together these books and these characters?
It is now because I belong to or have been a part of shaping the family, the immediate family I'm in now, and so it's it's really it's really sort of like a power source. It's plugging into the thing that has the most emotional meaning to me right now. And so my family, I have two children, their well-being, the challenges that they present to me as they change and become their own people, the challenges that rises within me, and sort of like the adequacies or inadequacies that I might present as a parent and father and husband, all of that isn't necessarily of interest to me as such. It's of interest to me, fictionally speaking, as a sort of a battery to um, to the events that I can sort of play out in it through the story. So the way that a family stays together or fractures is a source of energy and of stakes. Because if someone like myself, and I think a lot of my protagonists, they're either in search of a family, or have lost their family, or trying to maintain the unity within their family. Those are all the most important things to me. And so if I'm writing a thriller or a horror novel, I have to thrill or worry myself. And for me, the greatest worry is, again, sort of the idea of losing a family member, having to retrieve a family member, not knowing where my family is. These are the things that are of the greatest importance to me. And thus, what I hope I can sort of tap into and convey to the reader what ought to be important to them too.
And what I love about this is it creates this great juxtaposition, right? You're dealing with these elements of the supernatural and horror, but you're also grounded with this sort of this family story, which is infinitely relatable, right? Anybody who has kids, anybody who is in a marriage, instantly can see, or bond with those characters. Like when I was reading The Residents, it didn't matter that it was Franklin, Pierce, and Jane, president and first lady. I just saw this couple, especially with that opening scene, right, where they do lose their son in the train accident, and you can feel for them. So that sort of ripping pain of losing a child carries weight through the rest of the novel, and I love that because it brings that sense of humanity. Because with a supernatural thriller or with a horror, sometimes we can be sort of bound up into the world of the paranormal, but to have the characters ground us, I think it heightens the horror even more, especially later in the novel, without giving away what goes on. There's a test of their fidelity.
I think that's exactly, no, I agree completely. I think that's exactly right. That to me anyway, and horror and supernatural thrillers and thrillers generally these are broad genres or subgenres. And sometimes readers or writers want to just present just scares, just a thrill ride, and divorced from, or without the need to worry too much about what you've just talked about, characterization and that kind of thing. I'm kind of, I do like to go on the ride with a sense of, well, why am I even here? What are we doing? I mean, is it just to sort of like, throw jump scares at me? I find that, I used to, in my 20s, or maybe would watch, and I still do watch a lot of horror movies, and that would have satisfied me now. But I think, now at this stage of my life, I want more nourishment from my thrillers and my fiction, and that's how I make the writing of it, frankly, more interesting to me, is to feel the jeopardy of these people when I know them and care for them.
Yeah, and it's a tricky tricky road to navigate, to create enough sort of thrills for the lovers of that genre to go, okay, I'm invested, but also to create something where we actually care by the end what happens, because it's very easy in a horror novel or horror movie to rack up the body count, right? And when we actually care about those characters, it doesn't matter if it's one victim or 45 victims. I find the one victim, if we know and are invested in them, we care much more about that story than anything else. And that's what I found running through The Residence. It's I just kept trying. I'll be honest, I started reading it, I think it was like 8 o'clock at night. And then when I looked up at the clock, it was like 2 in the morning. And I was just like, I am riveted to this story, between Franklin and Jane, and sort of building in those elements of the White House, and also sort of pulling in some elements of history. I know you spoke earlier about, not wanting to write a historical novel, but at the same time, you are taking historic figures and planting them into your world. So my next question is, did you have to strike a balance in terms of how authentic you had to be to the history of Franklin, Pierce, and Jane, or how much leeway or latitude did you have to sort of explore the characters? Because obviously what goes on behind closed doors, we can only imagine. And I wondered, like, how were you able to sort of marry that sense of history with your own needs of the story?
Yeah, it was difficult, and I think that's and especially so, where this isn't just a novel about real people in American history. It's a novel about American history and real people, in which I also import, ghosts and demonic entities and things that are patently on the face of it, the material of mythology. So that was what I initially sort of saw, frankly, as sort of a special challenge. It's like, well, how do I sort of amp up and create, a thriller in this already fixed historical space? In fact, actually turned out to be a liberty, because I think once the story announces to the reader that this is a story in which the dead return to life, this is a story in which seances are held, which, by the way, we know for a matter of fact that Jane did have seances, and with the Fox sisters pictured there, among other spirit mediums, in an attempt to communicate with and bring back her dead children and dead son, in particular, Benny. We know those are facts, but to sort of push it further and presume that she was fully successful in this, I think allowed me to not worry too much about the particularity of the historical detail, because I'm signaling to the reader, you are now reading a ghost story. You're reading a ghost story in which there's real people and real events, but this is not pretending to have, it's not pretending to bear all the same responsibilities of being a historical novel, in the sense of, no, every historical event here is, categorically verified, because it's a ghost story. So that was a great relief when I realized, no, you can now just tell the story without when you're talking about real historical events like, slavery and the policies that Pierce failed to address that gave rise to great tragedy in American history. I had to get that right. But everything, as you say, the things that happened behind the walls, within the walls of the White House, I allowed myself full liberty with, because again, any sensible reader is going to know this is fiction.
Right. And just to give some context for everybody, the Fox sisters, can you give us a little background on the Fox sisters and their their claim to fame?
Yeah, the Fox sisters were the most famous and celebrated spirit mediums of their time. So in this period of American history, and in fact in the UK as well, this was the time of Victorian, sort of post-Victorian spiritualism. So there was a great fascination, very popular interest in the spiritual, speaking with the dead. And this wasn't just sort of a sideshow circus interest. This was in very polite, moneyed, educated society. There was very serious efforts to communicate with the dead. The Fox sisters were a set of sisters, young, appealing, apparently, by all accounts, and they rose to fame speaking to the dead through a series of clicks that would be made. And sort of through the numbered clicks, they could align those clicks with letters and form words and present these amazing communications with the deceased. The conventional wisdom is that they were revealed to be hoaxers when the clicks were the result of their toes. And so they had very bad, very noisy joints in their toes. So they would click their toes under the table and communicate this way. However, there is some counter evidence that was one of the sisters' tricks, that the youngest sister, Kate, actually had a genuine gift of mediumship. That the young Kate, pictured in the center there in that picture, was yes, she was a part of this scheming in these hoaxes, but she actually was also had the gift of genuine mediumship. And so in the novel, I separate her from her sisters in one scene in which a genuine seance takes place, sort of after a disappointing moment in a seance. Kate allows herself to do the real thing.
And if I remember correctly, spiritualism, like it attracted some high profile celebrities of the day. I think Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a spiritualist, and was it connected to the Fox sisters with the whole? He had fallen for the photo of the fairies or something like that. Do you remember?
Oh yeah. No, I don't think that had anything to do with the Fox sisters, but yes, but that was part. Yes, that was part and parcel of the whole supernatural fascination at that time, and it was taken very seriously. So Henry James, the great novelist Henry James, his brother William James was among the, if not the leading international psychologist at Harvard at that time, and he was a primary founding member of a society into psychical research. So this was a society that was attempting to find proof of the supernatural and the paranormal. And they were not viewed at all as, sort of unsober kooks. These were the leading men of science, thinking, literature, who were really seriously undertaking this effort. And so it wasn't sort of like at that time, the division between the living, the dead, the natural and the supernatural, the normal and paranormal was much closer than what is presumed today, where it's like, well, hold on, we've got science on the one hand, and we've got all this other stuff on the other. At that time, it was much closer and more continuous.
Yeah, and it almost sort of speaks to sort of a sense of the naivete of that time, right? Because from what I remember, I wrote a steampunk fantasy novel called the Eric Weiss Chronicles, and it featured a young Harry Houdini teaming up with Nikola Tesla. And when I was doing my research for it, I was fascinated because Houdini tried to debunk a lot of spiritualists because he recognized them as failed stage magicians who were just using their parlor tricks to convince people that they could contact the dead. So, with the Fox sisters, it was actually like the clicking of the toes. But for there was one spiritualist who I think had a fake arm. So like if people were supposed to hold hands around the table, the lights would go out, and then the spirit would ring a bell to let everyone know they were there. And it had turned out that it was the medium who had a fake hand and an accomplice, and then would just sort of slip their hand out and ring the bell in the dark, or think somebody could. There was one who could use her foot or her toes to lift objects underneath the floor and then ring the bell. It's incredible because like you look at it now, like from 2021, you go, I can't believe you would have fallen for that. Uh, but at that time, I mean, if that connection between life and death is that close, and especially when you're dealing with people who've had a loss in the family, you know, they do look for answers. They do want to see some sort of continuation, and that brings me back to thinking about, you know, Jane's sort of obsession with Ben, and knowing now that it's connected to sort of in real life, those letters that she wrote. I think about that obsession that she must have had. How were you able to sort of delve into that? I mean, I'm not trying to get too personal, but how do you deal with a character that's experienced like that kind of loss?
Well, you imagine, yeah, you know, you imagine it yourself, and it's uh, you know, you don't sort of live there, but you do call upon the what if of your own loss. You know, you imagine the unimaginable, or the really unsavory, deeply unwelcome hypothetical of what if I were to lose my children, right? And that, you know, to me is the most horrific thing I could possibly imagine. But to sort of, you know, to understand that character, as well as to kind of summon not just a ghoul to the page, but to summon a ghost or a ghoul or a presence that has particular meaning for the characters in your story. I think it does involve a large degree of personal involvement, emotional investment in in the loss of that of your characters or whatever they're going through. And so I don't think you can fake that, or at least sometimes you can read, you know, scary stories where it's like, oh, that was a scary tale. It was entertaining, but you feel the lesser degree of involvement on the page. And so it can be, I don't want to say it's an unpleasant task, because I actually love what I do, but that kind of grazing against the most awful things you can imagine, I think, is part of the task. And so for me, Jane, even though she's a deeply strange character in many ways, was for me someone I could really, she for me is a much more understandable character in many respects than Franklin, you know, because, you know, Franklin's kind of he's a more contemporary figure in the sense of he's kind of sort of a moving piece, a mouthpiece, a meat puppet, a politician, a polished nothing. But Jane's a genuinely fascinating figure.
Yeah, she is. And when I think about, like, when you were talking about that dealing with loss and that connection, it makes me think about the first book of yours that I read, the Demonologist, right? And you're dealing with the Professor David Ullman and the loss that he had, which sort of sends him down the road on that quest. And it seems like you have this this thread of people dealing with loss in a lot of your works, and that's why I was curious about if that's like an intentional thread that you're pursuing. Is it something that you need to exercise out of your own demons of dealing with those kinds of things?
I think it comes from, it's less as an exorcism for me personally than it is, I guess, you know, in scary stories and supernatural stories and ghost stories, the way in to the living characters is usually through a moment of emotional disruption. You know, when I've done a lot of research into purported cases of, you know, demonic possession or poltergeists, or people who live in, you know, really disruptive haunted houses, etc. And these are typically almost, in fact, they're never people who are, you know what, I was minding my own business, everything was going great for me, my life was all sorted, and then a demon, you know, came into my life. They are, when you kind of scratch the surface, they are almost always, and I've had a lot of personal conversations with people who have approached me with their stories of these experiences, and I always ask, and I get a very similar answer of like, well, why? What was going on in your life at the time that you had this experience? And it's always a moment of disruption. I just lost my job. I just went through a terrible divorce. I lost someone really close to me. Someone close to me was in a great deal of distress. I moved to a new community and I didn't know anyone. And it's in those moments of transition or disruption or loss that the supernatural finds a way in. And I mean that both in terms of, that's the precedent, but also narratively. So that when you have characters at a moment of disjunction and fracture, that's an interesting moment for me as a storyteller.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and I have a question that just popped up from Michelle, which is, have you ever attended a seance?
No, and I would, you know what? I am a real, I'm a student of the supernatural. I read a lot of firsthand accounts and studies and nonfiction, sort of stories of people who work in this field, but I would never personally do. I take it too seriously, and frankly, to sort of mess with it. Like, so, Ouija boards are not allowed in my home. You know what? I don't even read my horoscope. I I don't mess with that stuff at all. No.
Well, in your research, what in your mind was the most horrific haunted house or scary tale that you've come across?
Oh, well, there's a few sort of like ones that I've read about. I'll tell you the most, personally disturbing episode happened when I was actually writing The Demonologist. And The Demonologist, as you've already explained, is about a man who he loses his daughter in a presumed suicide. She jumps into the Grand Canal in Venice, but her body is never found. And he comes to believe, perhaps through the madness of grief, or perhaps because he is correct and everyone else is wrong, he comes to believe that she has been taken by a demonic figure, and he goes in search of her. And so it's a quest story. And I was writing a pivotal scene toward the climax of the novel, in which David Ullman, the protagonist, discovers that his younger brother, when they were children, was drowned, and by someone that was sort of close to them. So it's a very climactic scene, a very horrific scene. And I was writing this scene in which David is looking at this river where his younger brother is floating down the river. And that night, my daughter, who was then, she was probably like 7 or 8 years old, had a terrible nightmare. And she came into our room and she, stayed in our bed, and she was inconsolable. And the next morning I asked her, what was your dream about last night? And she said, Dad, who was the little boy in the river? And I had not, I did not share the details of the story. I wouldn't. I mean, that would have been bizarre. She did not know what the contents of my story was. But I don't know, I think a lot of people have felt that at times, where you're connected with someone. Oftentimes it's in your family, but it may not be, where you kind of share your mind or share the files of your brain. And I think it was one of those instances, but it was a bump against something that I didn't like, that you shouldn't be here. But she got something from my mind that I wish she hadn't.
Have you always been a fan of scary stories?
Yeah, always. Like I grew up on, my favorite, writers growing up when I was younger were, when, past the kind of, board book and picture book age, would have been Alice Munro and Stephen King. And I read them sort of interchangeably. Like, to me, it wasn't like Alice Munro was literary, Stephen King was horror. For me, it was like, oh yeah, no, they're playing in the same ballpark, because Alice Munro typically writes about small towns, sometimes strange, isolated people living sort of sad, isolated lives, punctuated with tragedy and loss. Stephen King, kind of the same, except occasionally, a vampire shows up. And so for me, I was always sort of like, no, fiction really, to me, interesting fiction always had that element of mystery, at the very least. What's going on in that one lit room in the sad old boarding house, which would be an Alice Munro trope. Or in Stephen King, you know, like, well, what's up with the people who just moved in next door and they never put on their lights and there's strange sounds and just that element of exploring a neighborhood or a home or a place or a family through the scary and the horrific. Was just in my DNA, my reader's DNA right from the start.
I blame Stephen King for every kid being afraid of clowns.
Yep.
Can't tell you the number of people go, I can't stand. I think we were all scared of clowns to begin with, but I think between Stephen King and John Wayne Gacy Jr., we now have a deep deep scar for any clowns that we come across. Oh, I've got a question from Jill Griffith. Who is your favorite supernatural thriller horror writer, and did they influence you?
Ooh, well, we were just praising Stephen King. It's hard to write in this space without acknowledging the immensity of his influence. But for me, I think, you know, the writer who I think about probably more than King is Peter Straub. Peter Straub has written a whole number of books. In fact, a couple he's co-authored with Stephen King. But to me, his novel Ghost Story, if you haven't read Peter Straub's Ghost Story, I would highly recommend it. To me, it's a masterpiece of the form. And the more I kind of write, I just reread Ghost Story this past summer, and I hadn't read it since I was, you know, maybe, I don't know, 18, 19. And I realized, oh my God, like how influential it has been on me. A lot of the tropes and the idea of guilt, the way that the past interacts with the present, even when you really, really don't want it to. But yeah, for me, I think, you know, there's a whole number of people I admire, but I think Peter Straub, his shadow is the longest for me.
And what was the one that he co-wrote with Stephen King?
The Black House, but is it Black House? Am I getting that right? Something House.
Okay.
Yeah. And and the Talisman, correct.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle. And the Black House. And the Black House. Excellent. Can we switch tracks a little bit here?
Sure.
I have a question popping up about your audiobook, Oracle. We have Roxy Thomas, who thought the Oracle was amazing, and do you plan to continue this series?
Oh, well, thanks. Yeah, it's pretty exciting because Oracle is an audio only book. So Audible Canada is sort of well, a lot of places are really pushing into this space of podcasts and audiobooks, and so it was new for me to sort of present a book in this way, but it's been really, really a very, very happy experience. And Joshua Jackson, the TV star and actor, actually performs the book, and he is the main character in a forthcoming audio drama. So to answer the question, yeah, there's more Nate Russo and more Oracle coming. And the next iteration is going to be a series of scripted. I wrote 10 episodes, 10 half-hour episodes of a story, and so there's going to be full cast. Josh Jackson is going to be Nate Russo, but there's going to be other actors playing the other parts and the other voices with sound effects and music, and so essentially a radio play, and that's just now it's in post-production now. So yeah, there's more Nate to come, but that's been a really, really fun experiment for me.
Well, do you think that supernatural or horror ghost stories lend themselves to that particular medium?
Oh yeah, oh for sure. Like, you know, a lot of people, Oracle has been a real surprise to me anyway. It really surprised success in that it's been top of the most listened to charts in Audible Canada, but as well in the US. And one of the recurring comments that I see on the reviews for the performance is, you know, when Josh Jackson playing Nate Russo, the character, he's haunted by, he's a medium. Speaking of mediums, he's a medium who works for the FBI, and he he's a very tormented guy who doesn't want this gift, but he has this gift. And his spirit medium is this extremely unwholesome figure called the Bone Man, who's terrifying, and he speaks to Nate. And Nate is the only person who can hear him. And so when Josh Jackson, the actor, kind of says, Nathaniel, half of the reviews are like, oh my God, when he says that, I gotta I rip the headphones off. There's this voice in my head. So to answer your question, yeah, I think it really, really lends itself well to a scary tale, because it involves you to see the unseeable, in the same way that a good scary book does it, and in a way that horror movies are uniquely challenged, because as soon as you see the thing, you're kind of, in a way, you're out of the story. Whereas in a good ghost story, you don't necessarily have to sort of describe the thing, because if you set it up well, the reader is going to do that for you.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That sense of whatever the reader or the listener can imagine is going to be far more grotesque or far more insidious than anything that a filmmaker could show. I mean, the example I give is, do you remember that M. Night Shyamalan movie, Signs?
Yes.
Aliens invading, and for I think the first half of the movie, he did a great job of just showing us glimpses of the aliens, like you'd see a hand or you see a shadow, and then I'm going to spoil it, but it's not worth watching. I'm going to say that right now. When we get to the moment where we actually see the alien, it's at a kid's birthday party, and you get one of those home movie shots, and then the alien walks in. I remember watching it in the theater. Everybody laughed when, this is supposed to be the horrific moment where we get to see the alien in its full form. And people laughed because they went, oh, is this what we're supposed to be frightened of? And it was because you build up in your listeners' or readers' imagination something that's so horrific that anything that's shown by comparison is just weak in terms of what's portrayed. Like when you tap into the mind of your audience, it's like you harness the nuclear power of somebody who can imagine the worst things in the world.
I completely agree, and I think I often think in that sense it's akin to horror. That is probably most closely aligned as a storytelling form, weirdly enough, with romance or with the erotic, because I think what desire is so personal, right? It's so unique to us. We don't know where it comes from, and it's something even quite late in life you're still discovering about yourself, like what excites you, what you desire in others is a lifelong, very personal, sometimes even secret journey. And horror, what frightens us is the same. It's so deeply, deeply personal and mysterious to ourselves. And so, to kind of just present something, you're going to desire this, or you're going to fear this. It's like, no, don't tell me what to desire and don't tell me what to fear. That's part of the fun, is to discover for yourself.
Do I see an erotic horror story by Andrew Pyper?
No, you don't.
Okay. Oh, Peter Baylor's got a question. Oh, this is an interesting one. This is one that I was curious about as well. Do you feel pressure from publishers to set the books in U.S. locales? Peter really enjoyed the Stratford setting in The Guardians, and I noticed that in a lot of your other novels, you do try to seed in something from specifically Ontario, right? Grimshaw was in The Guardians, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that was the setting.
Yeah.
So,
you know what? To be honest, I've never had that direction from an editor or an agent. Yeah. Typically the stories will sort of sometimes will demand an American, The Residence. It's set in the White House, so I'm obliged to set it in the United States. Sometimes as well, there are aspects to, Oracle, is another example where I needed to have a medium working with a federal investigators. It could have been, I guess, the RCMP, but I could not come up with any real sort of, in my research, instances of the RCMP working with a medium. There are, though, however, a number of unacknowledged officially, but actual cases where the FBI has employed psychics and mediums to work with them. So, and the scale of the country, the scale of the sort of, I wanted Oracle to be potentially, if we went forward with it, something that they would move around the country. So each story, each season, or each novel would have a different place at a different setting. So the United States is more inviting conceptually to a lot of those things. Canada is just, it's not quite as plausible a place for that kind of scale of infrastructure, investigation, multiple crimes happening coast to coast. We just don't, in a good way, we're not quite as bad. And so, but no, to answer the question, no, I've never been asked to or advised to or demanded to set a story in the States.
Well, I'll give you a shout out for being able to work in some Canadian locales in those books, because it's a little thrill, you know, as a Canadian reader to go, oh wow, this is great. We're recognizing something of our own. Randall Perry has a question. So the project that you were working on when you got distracted, when you discovered, you know, the White House hauntings, did you ever go back to it? And was it Oracle or was it a different project?
It was a project that I had gone back to and have completed, and it is, I shouldn't speak too much more about it, but it is going to see the light of day, but perhaps not in conventional book form. So that's sounding intentionally mysterious, and I apologize, Randall. Randall's a friend of mine, so he's fishing for info. But no, yeah, no. So that I did return to that project, and it is completed, but it may not be, you know, a printed book.
Oh, interesting. Okay, not a printed book. Okay,
it's going to be a chip that we put in people's brains, and no.
Yeah, with your vaccination. No.
Yeah, that's right.
No, I tried. Okay, I'm sorry. I apologize, everyone. I tried so hard. I almost made it to a full hour without making some reference to the pandemic, so I apologize. I tried to hold.
No, that was me.
Oh, you know Steve Strad and I gotta have our Pyper fix.
I do know Steve. I know Steve very well, and I know Randall very well. I don't want to mischaracterize them, but they are two great friends of mine and fans who are in a very friendly competition to be my #1 fan. So they're both here tonight.
Not in the Stephen King way. Not in the
No. Very friendly.
Okay, that's good. Speaking of other mediums, am I correct in saying that The Residence is being turned into a docudrama series on Discovery? Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. It's so it's in the sort of final edits now. So it is a hybrid. It takes some of the scenes from the novel and recreates them dramatically, but it is about the sort of supernatural events, the strange events that happened during the Pierce White House years, and also some of the subsequent hauntings and supernatural events that have occurred in the White House. So it's a 2-hour feature documentary, and so based on or inspired by The Residence. And I acted as a executive producer on the project, sort of consulting as to the, you know, the supernatural aspects and the lore and mythology of the supernatural in the White House. And so it's the last time I heard, it's going to be on Discovery Plus, the streamer, the new Discovery streamer at around the end of the month. And then subsequently it's going to air on cable on the Travel Channel, which is part of the Discovery sort of suite of different channels.
Great. And I know we're just butting up against the end of the time. I know it's late out in Toronto, but can you sort of leave us off with maybe one of the stories of the hauntings of the White House that you had discovered in your research?
Well, sure. So for me, the most kind of alarming and delicious was that, so there's Benny Pierce, that Jane Pierce, again, according to her this is all true, according to her letters, believed was in fact returned to her in material form. Benny is 11 years old at the time that he dies. A subsequent administration, only 2 administrations later, Lincoln loses his son, Willie, at the exact same age in the White House. We jump ahead to Taft, who is the president in the very early 1900s, so not that long after, just a couple decades. And there are so many sightings of a young pre-adolescent boy, ghoulish in form, extremely terrifying, in the hallways of the White House, that the White House staff refer to as the Thing. And they're all talking about the Thing. Have you seen the Thing? It was so troubling that Taft, we know, signed a memo forbidding any other mention of the Thing. And so it does invite the conjecture that Benny, in fact, returned to Jane. We know this because in 20 or 30 years later, during the Taft administration and subsequent others, multiple people, multiple witnesses have seen a ghoulish young child, a young boy in the White House. And so there's a continuity there that goes beyond just this one episode of this one administration. And you find this the more you research the White House. Supernatural, the supernatural aspect of the White House is that it's almost like a museum of the supernatural. There's so many entities there. It's a sort of an accumulation of energy that's increasingly kind of populated by the dead.
Great. Well, on that note, I have goosebumps now. On that note, thank you, Andrew, for spending the time with us. Again, everyone, if you enjoyed this conversation and you're curious about Andrew's books, you can check out The Residence, which is his latest novel. And you can also check out Oracle as an audiobook. Get both, because I think you'll enjoy pretty much everything that Andrew puts out. Meanwhile, I want to say thank you one and all for spending the night with us, and I am going to turn things over to Michelle.
This was wonderful. I still had the your 2013 visit. The bar was so high in my head. So you two nailed it. Thank you. This was a wonderful way to top off Starfest 2021. And I'm hoping, again, a couple more years that we can all meet in person, bring Andrew back. I mean, I hope we meet in person earlier than a couple of years, but bring Andrew to the library. And Marty, thank you as always. You're always game to jump into pretty much any schemes we have for you, including this one. So thank you very much. I'm going to do a quick thank you to our sponsors. Our funders are, the main one is the City of St. Albert. We're funded by the Friends of the St. Albert Public Library, the Alberta Foundation for the Arts, and Canada Council for the Arts. And our media sponsors are the St. Albert Gazette, T8N Magazine, and Edify Magazine. And a thank you to our partnership with the art and through all of this. Normally this would be the time I'm announcing the next one, but this next event, but this is the last one. So I will say to the attendees, you will be getting a feedback survey. Please fill it out. It will also enter you in a draw for a set of all the Starfest books, which is a pretty nice prize. And I want to thank everybody for supporting Starfest. So I'm going to say goodnight and goodbye, Starfest, until next year.